some of the assumptions we hear is that this is about the harms that white people caused to Black people. And so we're fixing something that's very narrow, whereas we really see repair as much broader than that. Wage theft did not just happen to Black people, right? I do think we have strong narratives about who has been impacted and why. And certainly we live in a system of racialized capitalism. And so those examples may feel most tangible. But we also know that wage extraction happened to all women, right? The pay equity gap is wage extraction. And so this work should also address that, right? So it is not limited to a specific race. It is not limited to a specific set of people. Many of the funders that we work with, the donors that we work with, the labor that was extracted for their wealth to be generated happened amongst white communities. And so we are seeking repair for those communities as well. So I think it's a much broader idea of this extraction has happened everywhere. How are we thinking about this holistically? I think the other thing that we hear is like, then this doesn't apply to Black people either because we were harmed in this process. And so our practices don't need to be aligned with repair. And I think that's a real choice point, right? If you understand your own cultural history, you understand how harm and oppression worked in that, you've got a choice point about as you develop your own wealth, do you want to continue to operate in that system or do you want to seek other ways to build wealth and engage in philanthropy that address the harms that you experienced as well?
Welcome to Black Philanthropy, Our Stories, where each episode spotlights awesome Black and African American leaders committed to transforming lives and communities through philanthropy. These authentic conversations will inspire, challenge, and remind you, you are not alone. Here's your host, award-winning writer, director, and founder of Samuel and Murray, Michelle Renee Jackson.
Hello there. We are so grateful for you today for being on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories. I am so grateful to introduce our next guest, Jessyca Dudley, who is, of course, the CEO of Bold Ventures. For our first-time listeners who are joining us today, we want to say welcome to you. My name is Michelle Renee Jackson. I am host for this podcast. I'm also a writer and director, and I'm also the founder and principal artist for our company, Samuel and Murray, who produces this podcast. How I enter into the space of philanthropy is through a fundraiser. Is through fundraising. I started fundraising in 2011. It's been an interesting, I'll say that, an interesting, and I'll also say lonely run. It has been so wonderful to discover so many Black leaders in this space of philanthropy like Jessyca. And so that is how we enter into this space to lift Jessyca up and also listeners to lift you up. We know that we have a range of listeners who come from a range of racial backgrounds, gender backgrounds, and even industry backgrounds. So we just say welcome to you. And that's awesome. And so, Jessyca, thank you for taking the time to be on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories. And for those who don't already know you, because I know you've got, again, of course, a pretty big following in the world, and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you enter into this space of philanthropy.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. Just the guests you've had have been so impressive. And so it's really wonderful to be included in this group. I'm Jessyca Dudley. I'm the founder and CEO of Bold Ventures. We are a strategic advisory firm that's really working with donors and institutions to understand how they can show up in the space of repair. So really thinking about how resources and power can be used to address past and current harms and how those strategies can address and change who's making decisions, how power is shared, sort of hopefully reshaping some of how philanthropy works. I came into this work with some experience in philanthropy, but a lot of experience in public health. And so it's really resonant with how I understood that we need to engage communities in this work and have shared power and shared voice, and brought those perspectives in that work into my ideas around philanthropy.
Why don't we start first with being on a page, not even the same page, but a page, which is philanthropy. I talk to people all the time. They're like, you know what I think philanthropy actually means. So you've got this whole range of what people think philanthropy is. And then when you get into Black philanthropy, it can become even more interesting on what those definitions are. But so that we are on the same page with you, Jessyca, what's your definition for Black philanthropy?
Such a great question. So I really think about two parallel streams of philanthropy. So there's the culture of philanthropy, which I think is what most of us grew up with within our own communities, maybe within our religious communities or our racial communities, our ethnic communities. There's the practice of care for others and the desire to have sustained relationships, sustained connection, self-service, right? That is the culture of philanthropy. And I think that's something that all of us, and we know throughout history, has been practiced. And then there's the business of philanthropy, which has a very unique, specific history in the US. And I think those two pieces are related, but they are different. And so I really do try to call out when I'm talking about the culture of philanthropy and that practice of giving that we are all a part of, and the business of philanthropy, which has a whole different set of norms and practices and underlying messages that are really crafted out of a unique American set of situations when in this country we saw the concentration of wealth amongst few in that Gilded Age, and the way that those structures and that sector has grown, which is quite different from our culture of philanthropy. So I think they're two separate things, but I like to talk about both.
When you're thinking about both the culture of philanthropy and also the business of philanthropy, one of my favorite questions is always, who are you thinking about when you come into this space? There are other ways to make money. There are other ways to be in the world. And you seem to have chosen to be a leader in the space of both the culture and the business of philanthropy. So is there anyone that you're particularly thinking of, or a community that you're thinking of, that you seek to honor, support, pay homage to when you enter into the space?
Yeah, so I am often thinking about my maternal grandmother and great-grandmother in this work and the way that they built community and shared amongst each other and really built these systems where they were able to care for each other. When someone had something, they took care of others. When others were in need, there was this sort of cooperative sharing that happened. I think at the root of what I am trying to build is that kind of ability for folks to have the resources they need, to share when needed, and to feel empowered to make decisions about how to use those resources because they know best how to solve the challenges that they're facing. And so I am often thinking of them in this work and the kind of relationship, community, and culture that they built around giving.
Your great-grandmother's names?
So Willie Mae is my grandmother. And Jewel is my great-grandmother. And so I'm often thinking about the two of them.
We're thinking about Willie Mae and Jewel today too. Thank you. What is the journey from public health and then now into reparative philanthropy?
Yeah, a very, very unexpected journey. So I spent about 10 years doing community-based research in public health, primarily focused on how did we understand and learn from young people of color about their reproductive health needs, and how did we develop opportunities for access and solutions for them. So I quite literally spent my time randomized to corners in Chicago, talking to folks, learning about their perspectives, trying to understand what we knew in academia versus what was actually happening in the lives of people. I was also a sex ed teacher, and I always say it's the best job I ever had. I learned how to improvise. I learned how to respect different perspectives, right? Like, you've got a captive room of teenagers, you're coming to talk to them about sex, they are going to try and test you and try and throw sort of wild questions at you. And I really learned, one, how to field those, but also how to field those with respect, to never judge what a young person was coming to me asking me about. And I brought that into my work in philanthropy. So I've been in the philanthropy space for about 10 years now. It was a complete left turn for me. So I was working in public health, primarily around reproductive health. And many of the young people that I was meeting were asking me about violence prevention, right? There had been a number of high profile, really tragic situations in the community I was working in where young people were killed in situations of gun violence. And they really wanted to have a conversation about that. And I was completely unequipped to have that conversation. I really didn't know that space. And so I started doing some informational interviews with folks who understood that space, trying to understand what I could do from a public health position in that space. And an informational interview led to a role at the Joyce Foundation. And I ended up working in the gun violence prevention and justice reform program for the Joyce Foundation. So primarily working in grant making around research that could lead to effective policies to prevent gun violence. And that was an eye-opening experience. I really didn't understand the sector of philanthropy. I had been on the receiving end of grants, but I didn't really understand what happened on the other side. And so joining the Joyce Foundation really created an opportunity for me to learn about that and to try and understand how to grapple with being Black, how to grapple with the power dynamics and the cultural change of being in philanthropy.
So you went from reproductive health, having a great time teaching young kids about sex, a captive audience. They leaned in, they showed up for their classes.
Yes.
I imagine they didn't, not a lot of tardy people in that class.
Yes, no, not at all, not at all.
And so then that leads you from sex ed to reproductive health and to students asking you about, or young people asking you about gun violence. And so then that leads you to the Joyce Foundation. So I'm wondering, from that journey from public health or education, public health, gun violence, to then being in the space of the business now of philanthropy, what was your initial impressions of how the sausage is made and how money is actually moved around?
Yeah, great question. So I think, one of the things that during that informational interview, as I was learning about this role, my future boss told me I was going to be very distant from community once I got into this role. And I didn't really grasp what she meant by that, right? So all of my work up to that point had been very community focused. I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer, right? I had really sort of taken on this ethos of let me sit with people and understand them and have that lead and inform my work. And so when I heard that, I thought, well, of course, as you sort of move up and you become a manager or a leader, you don't have the time and the space to be as embedded in community. And so that makes sense to me. What I really think she was trying to say is that oftentimes in foundations, particularly when you're thinking of that business of philanthropy, that institution of philanthropy, you may not be engaging with we would say the end users of philanthropy or the folks who may benefit from those grants in the kind of centered way that I was used to experiencing. And so oftentimes I was in meetings with academics, with other incredible leaders who understood this work and how to make change, how to determine and pass policy. And it may be that none of us ever sat with someone who was directly influenced by gun violence to make those decisions. And that was a really eye-opening experience for me, that distance. I also didn't have a deep understanding of the distrust that many people and many communities have for foundations and for philanthropy. I didn't understand that I would be standing in that tension and sort of receiving the doubt, the skepticism, the hurt of folks who had been harmed by philanthropy, and that I would need to navigate a history of an institution and a system that I had not participated in previously.
Jessyca, what does that harm look like?
I think for a lot of people, it is exclusion, right? It is being left out of positions of decision-making and power. Having folks who have never had any direct experience of your community or the challenges you may be facing dictate to you how to address and solve those challenges, right? I think there's also just the day-to-day sort of power dynamic of being a nonprofit leader, having a conversation with someone in a foundation, trusting in them, believing resources are coming, and then not having the transparency to know why something has changed, right? So I think it is the disconnect between sort of how work happens on the ground in institutions, in the nonprofits that are serving communities, and the structures sometimes of institutional philanthropy that just aren't a match for the work that needs to be done every day, and how we navigate that, and not always being equipped to do that in a way that is transparent and caring. And so a lot of harm and fracture and friction has been caused in those relationships.
All right, your eyes are open to this new world of giving the money and then people being hurt by the money or the lack thereof. What's next for you after that?
Yeah, so I think my time at Joyce was also really eye-opening that there was a difference between leading and developing programs, which I had done a lot of in public health, and actually developing and understanding how to implement strategy. I think that those are sort of different types of thinking, and I had some work to do to learn how to develop strategy. And so I very intentionally went into a role with Arabella Advisors, where I would be on the strategy side of things, right? So sort of how do we go up a level people in our thinking? How do we understand the interconnectivity of systems? How are we really thinking about ecosystem change? And how are we designing for, developing for that, and engaging people in those processes? And so went from being sort of a program leader, doing program related work and thinking about how to make grants, to really thinking about the bigger picture strategies, how we engage folks, and then starting my own practice where that's what we do full time.
Okay, so then tell us about Bold Ventures.
Yes. So Bold Ventures, we are coming up on our 5th year of work. We work with individuals, so families and people who are resource holders, as well as institutions, so corporations and foundations, who are really interested in this space of repair. So they are people who are thinking about what are the harms that have been caused by systems. How have we generated wealth in the US? So often through extractive practices, so labor extraction or environmental extraction, that has led to a small group of people having concentrated wealth. That is the process that's developed philanthropy, and how do we want to use that resource to address those harms, right? Some of those are past harms, some of those are current harms, but philanthropy can step in to address some of that. We see our work as sort of standing in the gap of a bigger change that we'd like to see, right? So a future that is more equitable, that is more, where there is less concentrated wealth, where folks have what they need. We're not there yet, but philanthropy has a role in this time, in this moment, towards getting us there.
What does that look like, let's say, for a corporation? How Bold Ventures, or how you might be able to help a corporation repair harm?
So we've had the wonderful benefit of working with some corporations that are quite honest about how their production practices contribute to either environmental harm or the extractive practices of labor that may have happened in the past actually robbed communities of their autonomy, of their resources, or did not pay them wages that allowed those communities to have what they need. And so we are working with those corporations to really understand in their philanthropic practices, and hopefully this is mirrored in their corporate practices as well, how they can address that harm. So sometimes that looks like funding opportunities directly back into those communities to make sure that there are educational opportunities for people in those communities, that the environmental harms of production are addressed. So sometimes that is putting back into those communities to address those harms directly. It is often also about how we change who the decision makers are in a corporate philanthropy space. So often in corporate philanthropy, you have people who have excelled in the corporation, who have an opportunity to lead the philanthropic work. We are often designing ways to engage communities who will be the receiver of those funds to help determine that. So that might look like participatory grant making, where we're actually bringing community leaders in a location to say, here is a pool of funds. This corporation wants to put it back into those communities. How should we be making those decisions? What should those funds be focused on? Who's going to make decisions? How do we move those funds so that there's a more direct connection between the resources those communities will receive and who's making the decisions about them?
How is that going, Jessyca?
It's going well. It's going well. It's hard work though, right? I think one of the challenges of philanthropy is we want to be experts. We want to have best practices. We want to sort of come out of the gate knowing what's going to happen and how to do the work. This is not a place where we know exactly how it's going to work. We're testing ideas. We're trying new ways of doing this. This is not sort of standard practice for the business of philanthropy. This is standard practice for the culture of philanthropy, right? So this is where there's that intersection where we are really trying to learn from this long history and legacies of giving in Black communities and other communities of color that have always worked in the space of shared decision making. How do we bring that into the institutional space? So it is a practice. I would not say it is the penultimate solution for this work, but it is certainly a practice. And I think we're learning every time we do it about how do we build trust? What is it really? What are realistic timelines for what it means to engage others in decision making? How do communities want to do this work? Not every community is going to want to engage in the same practices around participating in this work. And so how can we be responsive to the different desires of folks who are going to engage in this work?
Jessyca, in the 5 years that you've been doing this now with corporations, can you share a story that has been particularly meaningful for the corporation in reparative philanthropy and working with you?
So I think one of our greatest successes is building systems that are adaptable to the changes in corporations, right? So I think we're building for an ideal situation where a corporation wants to do this work, where there are resources to doing this work, and it can continue for a long time. I think the reality of that, particularly post-COVID for some of the corporations that we've worked with, is that the amount of resources available for philanthropy are dwindling. So how do we build relationships with those communities that corporation wants to fund, where when those resources change, there is enough trust and transparency to actually have a conversation about that, right? We know quite a bit of the harm of philanthropy is that decisions are made without community insight and it causes rupture. How do we build systems that allow corporations to adapt? So for me, that's a real sign of success, that we're thinking about, yes, there is this ideal state where we have all the resources we want for this work, but what happens if that's not the state we stay in? And how are we actually in deep relationship with the organizations we're working with so that we can communicate that? We can support them to find other resources. We can provide other resources that aren't financial, so capacity building or other resources that corporation might have access to. Legal support in this moment is one of those that comes up as being really important. Knowledge of IT and how to keep a corporation safe can be really helpful for a community organization in a time like this. So how are we thinking about the full suite of resources that we have, and when conditions change, making sure that we're communicating clearly and offering other resources that we may have?
This year has been an interesting year for lots of reasons. Every day is wow, did not see that one coming, or yet maybe we all should have seen that one coming. But particularly for corporations this year, particularly as it relates to philanthropy, it has been a challenging year for the sector of philanthropy, and then of course for corporate fund, giving as well. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of responses you've seen for corporations over this last year as it relates to how they're responding to challenges to philanthropy, how people fund? We're, just for the sake of our audience, we're in the fourth quarter of 2025, coming around the bend in October, and people are pulling their funding in many ways from lots of, either at the foundation level, the corporation level, or at the family level as well. So anyway, all that to say is, can you share a little bit about what you're hearing corporations struggling with and how the guidance that you're providing them on how to move forward?
So I do think, we have the benefit of working with some corporations where the philanthropy is not an afterthought. It is really deeply tied to the work of that corporation. And so that gives us some unique opportunities to talk about how do you stay mission focused in a time when resources may be changing, when the tax code is changing, and there may not be as much benefit to a corporation to engage in philanthropy. So I think that if an organization, and I think corporations have this, but organizations of any type have this, they have really clear values around why this work was important in the first place. We may see a change in the amount of resources, but we're not seeing them walk away from this work, right? They're going to get creative about how they can sustain this work, how they can stay engaged with this work. I think it's the institutions, the organizations, the corporations where the values around this work were not clear that are having the hardest time maintaining this work, because they don't have a grounding in the why they were doing this in the first place. Right. And so I think it's a lesson learned about the philanthropy can't be an afterthought if you want to be genuine and authentic in this work. I think we know that. But it does really take having mission and values alignment in order to sustain this work when it is as challenging to do this work as it is now.
For those corporations that might feel like, we might want to get off this train, but let's just call Jessyca anyway to see if what she might think about that. What is the guidance that you give there?
Yeah, so I think getting really clear about who are we serving and why. Right. I think a lot of times we like to, in philanthropy, just use the word community and then we don't define it. And that leaves us, again, really open to being swayed by what's happening in any moment, rather than having a deep clarity about who we are working with and how we can best support them in a moment of change. So I think, again, we're really asking folks to get clear about the why in this work, about the who they are serving, and then to talk to those folks about what is needed and how they can show up for them in this moment. So I think that commitment it might change, it could look different, but should always still be deeply informed by those who are being served by this work. And if an organization, an institution, a corporation has those relationships, this is the moment to go back to those. If those relationships weren't built, now is the time to really engage and think about how to build those relationships in a way that deeply honors trust and communication to ensure that they can be maintained through this time.
Jessyca, for the foundations that come to Bold Ventures for guidance and support regarding reparative philanthropy, we know what that looks like for corporations who may have created some harm. But what does that look like for a foundation to come to you for support?
Yeah, I think that can look like a number of different things. So one thing that we often are working on is governance, right? Really, who are the decision makers and how are decisions made within your foundation? And can that structure be shifted to change who's making decisions? So greater engagement of those who are going to benefit from the resources of the foundation. Or can those processes be changed to reduce particularly harmful impacts that may be happening? So a lot of that work is in that space of strategy and governance. Some of that work is also in thinking about what are the impacts that you want to have as a foundation? Are you building long-term change or are you solving short-term challenges, right? We know that to create sustainable communities over the long term who have autonomy for themselves in deciding how resources are used, we have to be investing in community power building and infrastructure building. So sometimes it's really looking at a grant-making portfolio to understand perhaps there are short-term challenges, urgent challenges that need to be addressed. And so we're going to do grant making for that. But can we also be thinking about the systems or policy changes that need to happen so that over the long term, perhaps those urgent issues are addressed and they're no longer urgent because we've made significant structural change. And we have resourced people and communities in a way so that they have the power to do this work. They have the resources needed to do this work for themselves with their community, rather than having to rely on and searching for philanthropic engagement in order to make that happen.
But is there a foundation that you have been particularly proud of the progress that you've seen made as it relates to reparative philanthropy?
Absolutely. So we have worked with some really large, complex foundations where the bureaucracy often feels like it would be a challenge to doing this kind of work, right? The levels and the steps for decision making are so complex and involve so many levels of decision makers with an institution that it feels like bringing more people into this would be just cause for chaos. And we have seen some of those organizations really use their sort of knowledge base around how to do grant making to really, one, educate and help other folks understand how these systems work, which is really important, right? Again, back to that transparency of how does philanthropy even work? And are we going to be open about that and sort of share with others what these decision-making processes are? And to find creative ways to bring in other folks as decision makers. So I think some of the work that we're most proud of is foundations who have said, you know, for us to really understand this landscape, to bring in new grantees, we need to bring in other folks who know these spaces better than us for us to enhance our work. So we are going to form an advisory committee or form a participatory grant making process. And with all of those processes, we have seen organizations that have never been funded by those foundations enter the grant making pool. And it's because other folks were able to say, let me introduce you to this organization, or because I sit in this community, I'm aware of people doing this work that may not be on your radar. Can we bring them in? Can we have conversations? Can we learn with them? And so we're seeing the impacts that those foundations want to have anyways strengthen because they are actually now more deeply engaged in the broader ecosystem of folks who are really working towards those solutions.
So we've talked about corporations and the reparative philanthropy that can exist there, foundations and the reparative philanthropy that can exist there, and then we have families, family philanthropy, we'll call it. Some family offices, some people are aware of family foundations, which is another way of saying a family office, depending on how they're structured. But anyway, you work with families. Can you talk about the size of families that you work with and even the range of income that you work with families?
Yeah, so sometimes we are working with an individual in a larger family network. Sometimes we are working with 2 or 3 generations of a family. In either instance, usually there has been some question raised about either how the wealth of the family was generated, or there is a question about who this family or this individual is accountable to in their work. And we often land in sort of one of two places, right? Either there is a really clear, direct connection to how the wealth was generated and a harm that was a part of that wealth generation that folks want to talk about, unearth, and address in their philanthropy. Or there is an understanding that participating in sort of our larger capitalist project has created some level of harm for communities. And there's an opportunity through the philanthropy to talk about that and engage in that and think about ways to practice philanthropy differently.
And so what are the wealth ranges for a family that might come to you for support?
Yeah, so we'll have a conversation with anyone. We often find that when folks are getting to a point where they're moving $1 million or more a year in their philanthropy, that has transitioned from we're going to write checks. We sort of have a universe of organizations we know or people we know that we want to give to a transition of we want to do something more strategic. We see the opportunity for a bigger impact if we had more thinking about the arc of this work, and particularly if we have multiple years of engagement in this work, we could be driving towards a different set of impacts or changes that we're hoping to see, and we want some support in thinking about that.
This idea that a family that has wealth, generational wealth, that they are even thinking through, what do you mean, like we harmed people? I don't even know what that means. And then second of all, I'm not even a part of that. So why should I be thinking about what my grandfather or my great-great-grandfather would have done? So can you just, if you're seeing a theme of the kind of harms that certain families that are trying to think through, we have the money to give to be helpful, and that tends to be, as you've said, if they're giving $1 million or more, they are thinking a little bit more strategically about what are some strategic ways we can have impact. But again, the question, it really is ultimately, what are the themes of harm that you're seeing of people who are coming forward and saying, we want to address what's been done and how we can be helpful with our giving?
We are often having these conversations with people who are inheriting wealth and have questions about the sources of that wealth. So we have an incredible client who has inherited over multiple generations. So she is probably the 10th or 11th generation in her family who has inherited wealth, right? She is very clear that one of the branches of her family where she has benefited from inheriting wealth was engaged in enslaving people in the West Indies. She knows that family history. She knows that without that moment of wealth generation, she would not be inheriting the funds that she has inherited. So that's a very direct link where she was interested in exploring what are the contemporary impacts of enslavement to communities in the US. How could her philanthropy, the funds that she was inheriting from that part of her family, directly address that? We have other families that we work with where the harm or the inheritance, the wealth generation is much more recent. So sometimes we are working with folks who, even a current business, is still engaging in some kind of environmental extraction because it is industrial. And folks are thinking about what are the harms to the specific community where our business functions? Are there ways that we can be addressing that very directly? So sometimes it's many generations of thinking about this and thinking about the pathways for that inheritance. Sometimes it is a business that is still in operation and members of the family or the family as a whole want to think about, okay, we would not have otherwise been able to amass this wealth without these practices. Is there something we are going to do in this moment to think about that and address that?
Are you noticing over the 5 years of you doing this work, particularly as it relates to families that you're working with, are you noticing a trend of an increase in a desire to be able to do reparative philanthropy or a decrease in the last 5 years to do this work?
I would say we are seeing an increase in this work, and maybe I'm being incredibly optimistic about this, but I do think that we are starting to have a different conversation about capitalism in the US. And I think that the more that we have that conversation and the more that we understand how this economic system functions, it creates more opportunities for folks to ask questions. And I think that's often what we're seeing. We're not meeting people who have necessarily a solution to that, but they are people who are asking questions. And I think as we see greater dialogue about the economy from a really systemic space, we are having more opportunity for dialogue about what is wealth, how is it generated, what is the impact of concentrated wealth to our larger community, and how do folks want to show up in that work? I think within family systems, right, it is often one or two people who want to have that conversation, didn't realize that there were other people in their family who are willing to have that conversation. So once they start talking about that, they're starting to see, oh, I'm not alone in my thinking about this. Or if it is just one person in the family, they're finding other wealth holders who are willing to engage in that conversation. And so I think as we have more community built around that conversation, we're seeing an increase in people who are willing to ask those questions.
Any one of your clients, whether it's corporations, foundations, families, is it multi-year? Is it a couple of quarters that you're with them?
Yeah, so I would say sort of the shortest amount of time we work with folks is 6 months. So someone who really has done a lot of work on this, has a lot of ideas about this, sometimes we can come together and in a 6-month period, really clarify next steps. I think we like to think about both the strategy development and the implementation. We're not going to do both in 6 months, right? So we might have a strategy, but then we're going to take some time for implementation. We also have folks that we've worked with for multiple years because as the work has evolved, we've stayed to be a part of implementation, and doing the work has opened additional opportunities. So I would say anywhere from 6 months to multiple years. The way that we work as a team, we hope to stay in relationship and connection with folks. So even if we're not sort of actively engaged in a project with someone, we're trying to stay in touch with people, continue learning from them, continue having engagement with them so that we can understand the long-term impacts of this work.
I always find this because I run my own business, you run your own business. And I always find, how are people finding these people who want to take on their services? And so I'd be very curious to know, are you finding that people are, the clients that you have, that they're coming to you, or that you're seeking them out or being referred to you?
A little bit of both. I would say a lot of this is word of mouth. A lot of this is that we spend a lot of time in spaces with movement leaders, really trying to learn and understand how we can best advise. And those spaces have led us to meet donors and other folks who are also interested in this work. So we are spending a lot of our time learning about repair and reparations, being in spaces where those conversations are happening. And that is a space where we meet other folks who are interested in this work.
Do you like this work, Jessyca?
Good, complicated question. So I think I am really excited by and find a lot of joy in connecting with people who are curious and are interested in really the practice of philanthropy and thinking about how we can shift the practice of the business of philanthropy. And so I get a lot of joy from being in space, sort of, I would say, untangling the sticky knot and thinking about how we can do this work differently. I also find a lot of joy from the outcomes of this work, right? When we are seeing new solutions develop, when we are seeing decision-making change, when we are seeing power built in spaces where maybe people have been denied access and power in the past. And so I think for me, that is where I'm finding a lot of joy and excitement about this work. I think there is also the hard work of facing these systems and being in these systems every day, which can cause quite a bit of wear and tear. And so finding that balance and really understanding sort of where can I show up and be effective, but also not drain myself to a point where I can't continue to do the work.
Well, then, and that's sort of an interesting theme that we have throughout this, with many of our guests, this question of the wear and the tear. And so I think for all of us in philanthropy, whether you're on the fundraising side or whether you're on the funding side or whether you're on the advising side, that it can be really painful work. I think it seems like a lot of us are personally invested in this work, particularly I would imagine for reparative philanthropy, that there are your own, making my assumption, tell me if I'm wrong, sort of personal connections to why this work matters, and the desire, the need, the requirement to have to do it over and over and over and over again. Like you're hitting the reset button with every new person you're talking to. It's like you're starting over and having the conversation for the first time can break people down. And so I wonder, for you, what are the ways that you find yourself being able to restore yourself so that you are able to have the energy and the joy and the hope to be able to keep on doing this for the clients who need your support?
So one is making sure there's enough time to step away. So not being in the work all day, every day. So our team, actually, we close our offices for the month of August. We take time away to restore ourselves, to do work outside of this, to spend time making sure we're connected to our families, our communities, to the spaces that we love. Because I do think it takes stepping away sometimes to be able to engage. So I think that practice of knowing we have this boundary time and we're actually going to step away is really important. I think the other piece is the relationship work, right? I don't do this work without the relationships that sustain me in this space. When I first came to the Joyce Foundation, there were a group of Black women in Chicago who I like to call my council of aunties, who I went to regularly. I was facing conversations I had never been a part of. I was hearing words used about the communities that I am a part of I had never used before. I had no idea how to navigate that, how I was going to show up in those spaces, what I could say, what I was safe to say, what I had support in saying. And it was really through the relationships with these women that, one, I even stayed in philanthropy. But I really learned how to navigate power differently. So I think it's that relationalness and finding places where we can have the honest conversation, we can share the challenges, we can vent about all the things that happen, and know that we are able to have those conversations and then think about how to show up for each other. That's so important to being a part of this work too.
Do you think that there is more room in the space in the sector of philanthropy for others to do this work? I think a lot of times people will find a space like, this is my piece of the sector of philanthropy, and I don't want anybody else to be a part of it. How do other people enter into this space as well of helping communities repair harm? Because there are so many people who are in the position to advise how philanthropy is moved. I should say how funding is moved around. But I wonder how they can do some of the work that you're doing, or if you think they should do some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so absolutely not a space we own, right? Not a space where we want to be alone either. And so we are always sitting in partnership with others because we want to be in that space of shared learning and understanding. And so we absolutely hope more people will think about how these practices can support their work. We really see the question of accountability. So to whom am I accountable in my work of philanthropy as a starting point? We hope more people will ask that question, and we really believe that if we were thinking about the practice of philanthropy from a point of accountability, work would start to change and people would do the work differently. And so we certainly hope that that's a broad question, right? That we're not the only folks asking that question, but that we're all struggling with that question in a way that allows us to think about our practices differently.
Are your clients scared, you think, right now with the sector of philanthropy?
I don't think that fear is necessarily the emotion that they're feeling. I definitely think there's uncertainty, right? We operate in a system that is fairly recent, right? The tax code that governs the 501c3 status is a pretty recent designation. So I think that we are seeing a lot of questions about that system has worked in some ways. There's many ways in which it hasn't. Is there something else that we need in this moment? So I think there's some curiosity, and I think there is a lot of questions about what we'll do in a moment of uncertainty. So again, finding relationships in this moment is so important to have these conversations, but I don't think that folks are fearful so much as we are in the quake of change, and folks are trying to find who they should be in this, how they're going to show up in this, and what work is theirs in this.
I first heard about the concept of reparative philanthropy when I was attending ABFI's conference earlier this year at Harambe, where Edgar Villanueva, who has the Decolonizing Wealth Project, was leading a session and talked about that approach to reparative philanthropy. And so in our previous conversations, I know you've said that there are some differences between how different communities approach reparative philanthropy and even what that perspective is. And so for our listeners who may have heard of reparative philanthropy and may think that there's one monolithic approach to it, can you share a little bit about how you might differ, or how Bold Ventures' approach to reparative philanthropy might be different from other communities who also do this work?
So I think that some of how we are different in our approach has to do with the assumptions that we hold about how wealth was generated and about where we're trying to go with this work. So our starting point, right, is that philanthropy doesn't exist in a space of equity, that philanthropy really is built on practices that were harmful because they either extracted environmental resources or labor resources and concentrated wealth amongst a small group of people, right? So we are really, again, speaking to the business of philanthropy, right? So in that space, we see an initial harm or series of harms leading to the creation of philanthropy. And our work is to challenge both the harms that have happened and the ongoing harms that continue because we are still in a space of extraction, and how we can transition away from these extractive practices, which for us ultimately means that at some point philanthropy doesn't exist or isn't needed because there wouldn't be the kind of extraction that has limited resources to so many people. And so I think both that underlying assumption about how philanthropy was created and the idea that we are moving, hopefully, to a place where philanthropy is not needed, I wouldn't say that's shared for everyone. I think some people feel that we can operate and build liberation and we can build justice and equity and stay in this space of capitalism that we are currently in. I don't know that that's possible. And so I think that's where we differ. And that is the tension that we sometimes struggle with, that we are working in a system, philanthropy, which we may disagree about why and how it was created and why and how it is necessary. And even for members of our team, we may not agree with how we got here. And so we are both working in a system and utilizing a system that we may not want to see the continuation of.
Okay, so essentially it sounds like the premise for your perspective on reparative philanthropy is ultimately that wealth inherently, at least in our current country, at the levels that it is, at the millions, billions, that ultimately is a consequence of inequity. And so for the world to be, I should say, for this country to be more equitable in its wealth distribution and philanthropy, that ultimately the goal is to make things more equitable. And that there may be a perspective within other communities within this sector of reparative philanthropy, or this approach towards reparative philanthropy, is that you can still exist in the system of inequity.
Yeah, exactly. That we really feel like the system itself has to change. And we see ourselves as standing in the gap of that transition, right? We're not there yet. I don't know that our team has great ideas for what happens next, right? But we can stand in this space of saying, in this current system, we can change the practices to minimize, hopefully eliminate some of these harms. But ultimately, for these harms, for this extraction to end, the system itself needs to change as well.
What are some of the assumptions that you have found to be inaccurate when people are coming into the space of reparative philanthropy, particularly as maybe they're coming to you, or they're learning about your work and they're thinking, that's not for me, or that is for me?
So I think some of the assumptions we hear is that this is about the harms that white people caused to Black people. And so we're fixing something that's very narrow, whereas we really see repair as much broader than that. Wage theft did not just happen to Black people, right? I do think we have strong narratives about who has been impacted and why. And certainly we live in a system of racialized capitalism. And so those examples may feel most tangible. But we also know that wage extraction happened to all women, right? The pay equity gap is wage extraction. And so this work should also address that, right? So it is not limited to a specific race. It is not limited to a specific set of people. Many of the funders that we work with, the donors that we work with, the labor that was extracted for their wealth to be generated happened amongst white communities. And so we are seeking repair for those communities as well. So I think it's a much broader idea of this extraction has happened everywhere. How are we thinking about this holistically? I think the other thing that we hear is like, then this doesn't apply to Black people either because we were harmed in this process. And so our practices don't need to be aligned with repair. And I think that's a real choice point, right? If you understand your own cultural history, you understand how harm and oppression worked in that, you've got a choice point about as you develop your own wealth, do you want to continue to operate in that system or do you want to seek other ways to build wealth and engage in philanthropy that address the harms that you experienced as well?
Which is so interesting, Jessyca, because, often what we'll always say is that philanthropy is part of the culture of being African American in this country, right? That through slavery, that philanthropy is how we supported one another, love for one another, but providing our finances, providing our food, providing our homes. And so it's an interesting twist. If we were writing a screenplay, it'd be an interesting twist that you might find families, Black families that are now socially mobile, upward wise, who are then having the same practices that were ultimately oppressive to us in the past. And so it's almost like we're ahead in the sense of philanthropy, which is to say, we know how to do this work. It's, I think, the reminder when we do have the funding to do this work, to be reminded of what our values are, how to love. Oftentimes, I'll talk with a lot of NFL alums, and the conversations that we tend to have regarding philanthropy tends to be generational, which is to say, the older the NFL former player is, the more philanthropic they tend to be. And then the younger they are, I should say, the more philanthropic they tend to be and the less money that they have, because if they started in the beginning, they didn't get these contracts that a lot of the current players are getting. So they are more philanthropic and yet they have less to give. And then you have the younger players who have more income than anybody could have ever imagined 20 or 30, 40 years ago, but they are less philanthropic. And I think the conclusion tends to be that the relationship to philanthropy tends to be generational, that there isn't the teaching of philanthropy that you and I might have had, or that our fathers or our grandfathers might have had, speaking intensive male for NFL players, that now the younger players are just don't have that proximity to giving their funds for the community. So anyway, all that to say is that you then find younger NFL players having the same challenges that, let's say, their white players may have as it relates to philanthropy, that may not have been as helpful for them in the past. What do you think about that? That's sense of generational change?
One, yes, absolutely. There's generational change. And I think that ability to reconnect with the lineages that have really shaped our culture and our practices is so important. I also think there may be a feeling that the sense of uncertainty, particularly financial, is greater. And so the ability to flow capital, to move resources, doesn't feel as secure as it once did. I think we're getting very different messages around philanthropy and its impacts. We've seen over the past 15 or 20 years a huge decline in trust for institutions, philanthropy included. So I hope that some of those younger folks who are stepping away maybe from the practice of philanthropy are thinking about other ways to engage in building community and relationship. It may look different. We know that people are using different vehicles, LLCs, donor advised funds. That makes it harder for the public to see what's happening. But hopefully there's an ability to reconnect, yes, to that lineage, to that culture of philanthropy, and engage in practices that continue to build trust and change who, in this opportunity, the decision makers are in this work.
With any of those brackets of the corporations, foundations, families that you work with who are feeling like, I want to be helpful. I have some questions about how we got this wealth. I have some questions about how we can be helpful with our philanthropy, but I'm not in a community that is either ready for that or even believes that should even be a part of the conversations that we should be having. And they might be feeling, I always say alone. Something can be really lonely being the one person that's like, I feel like we could be doing better and more kinder, more loving things with this fund. What kind of guidance might you give to someone who might be in a large, complex family or foundation corporation who this reparative philanthropy sounds really awesome to them, but also feels very much in contrast to what their colleagues or their family members might really want right now for their community?
So I think first and foremost, we always think about starting with listening, right? Who can you be listening to in the communities that your philanthropy is serving? How can you be building relationship with them? So even if you're the lone person in your family network who's saying, hey, I'm going to just go sit down with some folks and have a conversation with them, understand the impact of the work we're doing, if there's other things we could be doing as a family to support them. I think that's a really important starting point for this work, is to engage in that kind of listening. The other piece of it, that relational piece, that being around other folks who are doing this work, having connectivity, that is part of the role that we play. Oftentimes, our work is really to stand with folks who are exploring this and help them think through some of those challenging questions, think about how to have conversations with their family members or with other folks in their network who maybe have expressed some resistance to this work. That is the role we play in really helping people think about this and be a partner to them in doing this work. I think we are really in a position of wanting to meet people where they're at. We don't expect everyone to come to the door having done all the work, done all the research, have all the ideas. Sometimes we're just saying, in the context of your family, in the context of your network, in the context of your histories, what is the work that can be done? Can we partner with you in sort of parsing out what that looks like? Because again, this is a practice. It's not a, we've got all the solutions, here's what to do, but it is a practice that we're building. And so where can we start?
One of the things that I often think about for each of our guests and for myself as well is the sense of, why you, right? Why you, why now? So I think for a lot of us who are in this year where it just feels, it's a painful year, right? I don't know anybody who's like, man, this year is just winning. It's not winning, regardless of what side somebody are, what side of the aisle they are on, economically or any of that. It feels like, God, this has been really challenging. And, my thought always is, maybe that you, myself, and so many of us right now have been created for moments just like this. I'm so proud to do this podcast. I'm so proud for it to be a source of hope for people and community for people who might be feeling alone in a time where the sector of philanthropy, I'm unaware of it having a more challenging time than this in 2025. So I'm grateful to be able to fill that gap, even just as a storyteller. But I wonder for you, if you have a sense of why it matters that you exist right now in doing this work for your foundations, for the communities that you serve, for the families, for the corporations.
I mean, I think one, just as a team, we bring such an interesting sort of combination of experiences, right? So folks who have worked in the nonprofit sector, who have worked in government, we have these different vantage points. We also have unique ethnic backgrounds that mean we're bringing these cultures that we've participated in into this institutional space. So I think collectively, it's about the many viewpoints that we bring to this work and how critical it is to have that diversity of viewpoints in a moment like this, where we're going to throw out an idea, we're going to throw out into practice, and it might get pushed back to us, and we need an alternative. We need a group of thinkers who can move around the complexities of this moment. So I think in the one place, it's that. I think on the other hand, for me, it's really about a set of learnings and practices, particularly around engaging folks who have been just isolated from the decision making, and the practice that I have in that throughout my career, and how vital that could be to shifting what philanthropy looks like right now. So I think that sort of the work that I've done in public health, that I did in institutional philanthropy, has prepared me for this more complex moment in a way that allows us to be flexible and adaptable to the changes that are happening every day in the space.
10 years from now, 15 years from now, or however many years from now, where you might look back and think about the ways in which you showed up in a sector, right? You're not someone who is just a program officer at a small foundation that's just trying to help people get attached to some money. It sounds very much like part of what your desire is to do is to help transform in many ways, a broken system. It's a system that works in really great in some ways, and it's another way you're like, this thing needs to be in the shop, like dismantled and put back together with different parts. And so what is it that you want your legacy to be when you look back on how you showed up for this sector?
I think there's two pieces to that. So one, I hope that we have created a space where more people understand how philanthropy operates. I don't think we change philanthropy without more people being involved in understanding how it works. I think much of how it's operated is to be opaque and to keep folks out of understanding how decisions are made and how it operates. And that has been effective for continuing a set of practices that are harmful. So I hope we are opening that door, creating the space, sort of showing how it works so that more people can engage and push and challenge how philanthropy works. The other side of that is that we hope a new set of practices emerge in this space. So we do hope that we shift the question to accountability and that more people practice philanthropy from a space of saying, because I'm accountable to a group of people or because I'm accountable to a space, I am informed by those people in that land and how I do this work, and that changes the practices of how we do philanthropy.
Does it matter to you that you're a Black female in this space leading this company?
Matters every day. Yeah. So I think, again, the perspective that I bring to this work is different. The way I'm going to show up is different. I think it means I can ask a different set of questions. I can also speak from a different truth when I'm in this work. I think it's also dangerous and fearful and all of the things that happen when you show up as maybe the only or maybe one as a few in a space. But I think it's always been my hope that I can step into that I can take risk, that because I have the support of my community and I have the support of other people who are interested and engaged in this work, that I can step forward and say things and try things that maybe other people don't have the social capital or connectivity to be able to do. And that is part of my responsibility.
Is there a failure or a mistake that you've made in the last 5 years running this company that you have found as it relates to reparative philanthropy, particularly informative or valuable?
A few years ago, we had this idea as a team that what was really needed in this space was a deeper conversation about anyone who is a resource holder. So if you are an inheritor, if you are a wealth generator, if you work in an industry where you control the movement of resources, we were going to bring all these folks together. We were going to talk about values alignment, and we were going to help people understand how as resource holders they could show up in this work differently. That was great. We built out this whole curriculum around it. We had multiple sessions every month. We were so excited about it. I think what we learned was that that was too broad of a definition, that we're not actually in a place where folks feel connected because they are resource holders. And so we needed to be much more narrow in thinking about who could we talk to, who could we reach, who understood the influence they had, and how did we define that? So we sort of, I would say, went too broad. The other piece of that was really understanding like what everyone's individual capacity for learning and change is. And I think we sort of overwhelmed folks with the amount of information and conversations that we wanted to have, and our excitement, I think we overbuilt. And so we found that we needed to sort of scale back, be really, really responsible about what people could hold in a moment and really work to that space. I think we also realized that we needed to do a better job, a deeper job of building community and understanding, and that we were limited to do that in a virtual space. And so looking ahead, we're thinking about how do we bring people together in person? How do we really think responsibly about how much anyone can hold in this moment? And how do we actually build connectivity and accountability amongst the community rather than to us, so that folks have peers in this work to check in with, to talk to build together, to collaborate with, so that the connections are amongst the group.
Jessyca, when you think about Willie Mae and Jules, and it's certainly my perspective. I don't put this on you, but my perspective is that I'm always looking forward to the moment where I can see my father again, my grandparents again, our ancestors again, and would like to be able to show up and tell them that I did what I believe that I was called to do. And I wonder for you, what do you think Willie Mae and Jules think about you in this work that you're doing right now?
I mean, I hope they think I am caring forward the practice of care that they instilled in me. Just the women in my family, and my mom included, are all in caring professions. And I hope that I have found a way to bring that forward in this work. I also hope that they see me as that connector and community builder that they were for our family and the communities that we've been a part of. That in my own way, I've really been thoughtful and mindful about how to bring people together and to build connection amongst them.
So far, so good. So far, so good. My last question for you today, Jessyca, really relates to this question of hope. And it's always my favorite question to ask because it can, again, it can feel like you're belaboring the point. It just feels cliche to be like, this has been a shitty year. And for many, it's not even a shitty year. We're in a government shutdown right now, right? So that has lots of implications for people's health care, for people's livelihood, their jobs, and on and on and on. And so sometimes it can feel like when we have these conversations that it's existing not in the real world, and we are living in the real world where people are in real pain right now. And then there's this sector of philanthropy with trillions of dollars under management, giving away billions of dollars each year. And I just sometimes wonder, it can feel like, yeah, but what about that? What about all these people who are feeling pretty hopeless right now? And so my question to you is, are you feeling hopeless right now? And if you're not feeling hopeless right now in the midst of all that's happening in this fourth quarter of 2025, where does your hope come from if you do have any hope at all?
Yeah, so I think I draw just a lot of inspiration from the people that I see running ahead, right? I think that this is a moment where I have seen more community cohesion, more connectivity than I have probably ever experienced. Just thinking about how Chicago in this moment has responded to ICE has been an incredibly tragic time. And also one where I have seen community come together in a way that I've never experienced. And so I think I'm drawing hope from, in this moment of pressure, we are showing up for each other in really astounding, put our bodies on the line kind of ways. So I am drawing a lot of inspiration from that. I think that if we really look at our history, it is hard to be fatalistic about where we are now because we have come through so much and we have remained here. And so I think that I draw a lot on that and really understanding history to understand this current moment. And I don't know that I will always love the word progress, but it is progress in many ways. It is far from where we want to be, and we are not where we need or want to be. But we also, I think, to honor what has happened to this point, can't be fatalistic about this moment and have to continue to push forward.
It can be additional pressure, but it's also, I think, contextualized that, for so many of us who descend from enslaved people in this country who have been here for a minimum of 7 to 8 generations, maximum 16 generations, that it just feels unreasonable that we would be able to bow out of this moment. Again, it's exhausting, but then I can think of Willie Mae and Jules and Grandpa Solomon being like, exhausting. It's been exhausting for a bit of time for them as well. And so as our descendants, and I think, again, regardless of race, I think there's so many people, I forget sometimes that if your ancestors came here by choice via Ellis Island, be under the boat as our ancestors did, there are individuals that run through our veins that we can draw on if we're feeling like, I don't really know what to do. Well, be quiet a little bit, and maybe we can get some guidance from those who came before us. You are a source of hope. I think so many of our guests are a source of hope here. We are all putting our shoulder into it right now, and are going to keep on doing that, which is awesome. Jessyca, how can people stay in contact with you if they want to connect with you?
Honestly, I'm very extroverted. I love to meet and connect with folks, so would love to have a conversation. So feel free to reach out to us. We've got a website, we're on the internet, all the things, but hopefully would love to be in conversation with more folks about this work.
You can definitely reach Jessyca on LinkedIn, of course, because we know she's there. And then do you have a website for Bold Ventures?
We do. It is at alltogetherbold.com.
Jessyca, before we go, is there anything that you want to say before we scram today to our guests?
Thank you so much for even engaging in this conversation. I appreciate folks sort of being willing to ask these questions, and let's be in community around this and see what kind of change we can make.
Jessyca, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for honoring Willie Mae and Jules, and for all of the communities that need repair through philanthropy. Thank you for being that person. And thank you for also teaching sex to young adults who are just like, we need help. Thank you for being that helper in that way as well. All right. We'll see you later.